Now I'd like to present Bruce Macfadden. He will be presenting on Ice Age Pleistocene Megafauna of the Big Bend area, Florida.
Thanks to Jim Dunbar for inviting me to give this presentation. Thanks to Jana for all of her help and patience with me with all my emails. And thanks to the community here for welcoming us to your beautiful town. So yeah, I want to talk about Ice Age Megafauna of the Big Bend region. And thanks to, you saw this in Lee Newsom's slide this morning. I want to focus on, Lee focused on the sedimentary sequence from Florida, which goes back into the Cenozoic from the Eocene from about 55 million years ago until, of course, the present day. But I'm going to focus on the kinds of megafauna that have lived in the Big Bend area in the upper part of the sequence that Lee talked about this morning, the Pleistocene, of course, which is also called the Ice Age, as you know, and the Pleistocene extends back. And as she said, this is a fun graph because it's sort of whimsical, but the age of the beginning of the Pleistocene has changed over about the past decade or two from, in here it says about 1.8 million years ago, but it really is now about 2.6. So the Pleistocene has gotten bigger. So I'll talk about the kinds of animals that have been native to this area over the past 2.5 million years, more or less. Okay. We have over 1,000 vertebrate fossil localities in our collections at the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville, many of which are on display. And of those 1,000 localities, the majority of them are from Pleistocene. And as you can see, this is just for fossil horses, which is my interest, but the map is clear that Pleistocene localities are widespread throughout the state of Florida. And of particular relevance to the Big Bend area, you can see in the blue oval that there are several localities of significance and importance in this area. And I'm going to talk to you about the kinds of animals that we have cataloged in our collections that relate to Pleistocene. Before I move on, I want to talk about Dave Webb, who was my mentor, and Jim is smiling and shaking his head. Dave Webb, of course, for those of you who've worked on the Oscilla project for decades, you'll remember that Dave was an inspiration to that project, a colleague of Jim's. He also, as I said, was a mentor to me. And a lot of what we know, not just from the Oscilla River, but of the Pleistocene megafauna of not just Florida, but the southeastern United States, is thanks to the hard work of Dave Webb, both in the field, but also he was a very good theoretician, and he used ecological and evolutionary theory to explain the presence and distribution and evolution of the megafauna of Florida in the Pleistocene. So, if we took a field trip back into time and walked through what was then the forests and the prairies of what's now the Big Bend area, these are the kinds of animals that we would have seen back during the day. We would have seen this Titanus in the lower left-hand corner, the flightless terror bird, right-hand corner, the saber-toothed cat, gators, of course, zebras, okay? Equus, of course, encompasses the zebras of Africa as well as the domesticated horses. There's evidence that the Equus of Florida had zebra lineage in it, as well as that lineage that gave rise to domesticated horses. Various types of proboscideans or elephants, the mammoths and the mastodons. The giant ground sloth, of which you could see a jaw downstairs in the display table. And this was basically, and a couple of other kinds of megafauna that you'll see, that you could see some camels and llamas in the left, a bear, etc. So this is what if we were to go on a field trip, this is what we would have seen 2 million years ago. Of course, if we go on a field trip today, all of these are gone. Okay? So I'll talk a little bit about why that is in a few minutes. Yeah, so the megafauna is defined by most scientists as large or giant animals of a region, particularly larger than about 50 kilograms or 100 pounds. Okay? And I want to talk about how all the Pleistocene megafauna came together, and we have to understand about their origins, and there are three explanations for where the megafauna came together to contribute to the native mammals that we have appreciated based on the fossil record in our collections. The first are those constituents of the megafauna that were native to Florida at the beginning of the Pleistocene 2.6 million years ago. This would include upper left-hand corner, the horse, zebra, upper right-hand corner, large camels, lower right-hand corner, this is of course a modern-day llama, but there are fossil llamas in the fossil record of Florida, and of course then proboscideans, like you can see in the center, the mastodon, and then the mastodon skeleton in the left. So this is the resident biota of megamanimals that lived in this area, and indeed in all of the southeastern United States, southeastern North America during the Pleistocene. During this time, we also had ancient forest dwellers. So when we find tapirs in the fossil record, they're very specialized inhabitants of forests, and basically they are good forest indicators. So when we see a preponderance of tapirs in a particular fossil locality, as with deer, Otocoileus, during the Pleistocene, we know that the paleohabitat represented by those fossils in that locality are dominantly forest. Is dominantly a forested habitat. And we find that very often in areas like in the Big Bend. So I want to talk about some, in addition to the herbivores that I've shown you in the past two slides, the tapirs, the proboscideans, the camel-like animals, the horses. I want to talk about the predators, the native predators that fed upon the herbivores that were part of the resident biota here. So in the upper left-hand corner is a beautiful skull in our Florida Museum collection of a saber-toothed cat, Smilodon. In the lower left-hand corner is a classic mural, a night mural that's actually from the American Museum or the Smithsonian of a Smilodon. And then the right-hand column of pictures is a skeleton of a direwolf, which we have evidence of it that existed in the Pleistocene of Florida as well. And the lower right-hand corner is a sense of the fact that the direwolf was the largest wolf that ever lived. So now I want to talk about, we've talked about the animals that were native to Florida and the Big Bend area at the beginning of the Pleistocene, 2.6 million years ago. I now want to talk about immigrants from the Old World that came in and became part of the resident biota after the beginning of the Ice Age, or the beginning of the Pleistocene. And the way we explain this is simple. During times of lower sea level, during past glaciations, we have, of course, most of us know that there's the Bering Straits. And during times of lower sea level, there was the Bering Land Bridge that crossed between Siberia and Alaska. And this basically formed essentially a dry land connection for animals to disperse either eastward into North America or westward from North America into the Old World. We're, of course, interested in Florida in terms of the animals that dispersed eastward from what's now Siberia all the way and populated North America and then ultimately into Florida. And the most spectacular in terms of the megafauna immigrant from the Old World is the elephant relative, the mammoth. We talked about the mastodon, but we also had the mammoth, and you likely know that the mammoth and mastodon they have been found in the Osceola River. In fact, the skeleton on display at the Florida Museum that you see in the photograph in the left was collected from the Osceola River. The mastodon that I showed you in a previous slide was also collected in the Osceola River. And this is not. Kids ask me, was that the woolly mammoth? I know all about the woolly mammoth. Well, no, it was not the woolly mammoth. It was the cousin of the woolly mammoth. It was the Columbian mammoth, a larger variety of this proboscidean and, of course, related to modern-day elephants. The other question I get is, how can two very large proboscideans that are relatively two large megamammals that are essentially fairly closely related by the fact that they're both proboscideans, how can they exist and compete in the same ecosystems? And if you look at niche theory, this is very beautifully explained by mammoths and mastodons. The mammoths have a tooth that you'll see in the lower left-hand corner, and that has a series of cemented plates and a flat grinding surface, which is well adapted for feeding on grass, so it was a grazer. And then on the other hand, the mastodon has a tooth in the upper right-hand corner where it has more bulbous projections that almost are like scissors and would shear softer plant material, for example, like leaves on trees or soft bushes and shrubs. So it was a browser. So very clearly, based on its dentition, the way we can explain the ecology or the ecological differences in niche theory related to the two different proboscideans that lived in this area during the ice ages is based on the fact that they partitioned their environment to feed on different kinds of plant foods. 500,000 years ago, more or less, another immigrant came in from the Old World. Bison and its relatives are part of the family Bovidae, and the evolutionary origins of the Bovidae occurred in the Old World, mostly in Eurasia and Africa, over the past 20 or 25 million years ago. And then, at about 500,000 years ago, during a lowered sea level stand, these bovids dispersed from the Old World into North America and populated all of North America and even into parts of Central America during this time. So we find bison plentiful in North America. We find bison plentiful in Florida during the ice ages. Of course, it's not here today because it's been extirpated since prehistoric times, meaning that its range has shrunk to its present location in the Great Plains of North America. The interesting thing about this particular skull that's on display at our museum is if you look at a close-up of the top part of the skull, there's a projectile point in this skull, and this was collected from the Wassissa River, right, Jim? And were you involved in the collection of that?
Actually, Roger Alex.
Yeah. Yeah, so,
I think that's a correct age.
yeah, so if you want evidence of direct hunting of humans, it doesn't get any better than this in the fossil record. You have a spear point embedded in the skull of an ancient bison, okay? And that really is a spectacular specimen. And it's on display at the museum in Gainesville, and I think there's a cast of it in Tallahassee as well. Is that correct? Yeah.
One downstairs on the table.
Yeah. So anyway, this is a spectacular find, and it's proof, or it's evidence for the interaction of humans that populated Florida after the last glacial and interacted with the megafauna. The third source of the Pleistocene megafauna in Florida come from South America, and this is something that I've been working on for much of my career. And this has to do with the fact that about 4 to 5 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama formed a dry land connection between the Americas. Prior to this time, there was a seaway, and the Isthmus of Panama was not there. But then through volcanic activity, we had islands that coalesced and formed a land bridge. So animals that evolved in South America traveled northward. Like you can see the arrows traveling north in here. You had and I'll talk about these animals in just a second because most of them got into Florida, including most of them in the Big Bend area as well. And conversely, animals that were native to North America, like the horse zebras, the bear, the camels and the llamas, the dire wolf, and the proboscideans originated in North America, and they traveled southward, and they crossed the Isthmus of Panama. And this what has been called in paleontology a grand natural experiment, resulted in what we call the Great American Biotic Interchange, or GABI. So the reason that we find South American immigrants in deposits of Pleistocene age in Florida is the third biogeographic source of the diversity from South America. And one of these, in addition to the proboscideans are separate. The proboscideans have two origins. The mastodons were native. The mammoths were dispersers from the Old World. But the other giant megafauna that lived in this area during the Ice Age or during the Pleistocene, was the giant ground sloths, which you can see a skeleton on display in the upper right-hand corner. And these particular ground sloths are related to the common or the modern two-toed sloths that live in neotropical forests of today, Calipus. There wasn't just a single migration, which is interesting, but there were multiple migrations of different sloths that came across into North America at different times over the past 4 to 5 million years ago. And you can see some examples of these in the lower right-hand corner in this cartoon. Okay? And I think, do we have sloths from Oscilla? Are there sloths from Oscilla? Yeah. There are. Okay. Yeah, good. Okay, another animal related to the modern armadillo that is found in Florida during this time was the giant armadillo. And you can see it's called giant because there's a person next to it for scale, much larger than the modern 9-banded armadillo, Dasypus novensinkus, that we see in Florida today, which is an exotic that was introduced during the past century 3 or 4 times. And then there was another animal related to armadillos called glyptodonts, which got really large, and people like to say they were about the size of a Volkswagen. But anyway, these are other kinds of edentates. Along with the sloths, they form a major family group called the edentates, which include the giant sloths and the armadillos and glyptodonts, which we have evidence of. They originated in South America. They dispersed across the Isthmus of Panama as part of the Great American Biotic Interchange, and that's why we find them in sediments in Florida, like places like the Big Bend area. Okay, so the quail. We all want to know why we no longer see these animals in Florida. Why can't we appreciate them? We can appreciate them as fossils, but we can't appreciate them living today. And of course, this is a speculation as to why animals, the megafauna, become extinct. There is no simple, in my opinion, there is no simple explanation, but it's potential combination of causes, of which I'm going to talk about 3 of them. And one is that during the Pleistocene, over the past 2.6 million years ago, there have been many cycles of warm and cold, glacial and interglacial cycles of climate change. And when the climate change, of course, when the climate changes, the vegetation changes, and the herbivores that feed on the vegetation adapt accordingly or don't adapt accordingly and become extinct. So one potential cause for the extinction of some of the megafauna would include the predominance of climate cycles and adaptation, climate cycles and adaptation or not of these animals during the ice ages. Another thing is the balance of nature and competition and selection. So at the beginning of the Pleistocene, of those three herbivores, the horse, upper left-hand corner, bison, the lower left-hand corner, and the mammoth, upper right-hand corner, only one of them was, we know based on their teeth that they were all grazers, but only one of them was here at the beginning of the Pleistocene. At 2.6 million years ago. At about 1.5 million years ago, the Columbian mammoth came in. And it also is a grazer, so it started to compete for similar resources, grasses, with equus. And then at 500,000 years ago, more or less, the bison came in. So here we had 3 mega herbivores that were all competing for the same resource, that is, say, grass. And whether or not certainly the bison has restricted its range, but there's some stable isotope geochemical evidence, the kind of stuff that I work on, which is a whole nother story, that indicates that that horses were primarily grazers until the bison and mammoths came into Florida. And then, in a sense, the horses were pushed out of the grazing niche, which was then occupied by the bison and mammoth. And perhaps that is part of a reason for why why equus, the horse and zebra, became extinct in this area during the during the latter part of the Pleistocene. So a second explanation for potential causes for the extinction of the megafauna is the balance of nature through the aspect of ecological competition. And then the third potential explanation for at least some of the cause of the extinction of the megafauna at the end of the Pleistocene, perhaps overlapping for about at least 3,000 years, after about, as Andy told me last night, from about 15,000 years ago till about 12 to 10,000 years ago, where most of the large megaherbivores are knocked out in the fossil record, it's highly likely that some of these megaherbivores were negatively impacted by overhunting, or what Paul Martin from the University of Arizona used to call the Pleistocene Overkill Hypothesis. And we see this, we actually, as you saw with the Wakisa bison skull, direct evidence of predation. And this actually is a mural, a James Maternus mural, who is a famous muralist who did a lot of the murals at the Smithsonian, but did a mural for us to depict the kill site, the potential kill site environment from the late Pleistocene of Florida. And I think it depicts the Osceola River. Okay, whether we could debate that or not doesn't really matter, but this is an example of what a kill site might have looked like in Florida after about 15,000 years ago, until mammoths became extinct locally about 9 or certainly 10,000 years ago. Okay, so to wrap up and for take-home messages for my talk, fossil vertebrates from the Florida's Big Bend region preserve a rich record of extinct Pleistocene megafauna. The origins of this fauna is complex from 3 sources, including natives and immigrants, and the immigrants come both from the Old World, when we had a lowering of sea level and the crossing of the Beringia, and then also the formation of the Isthmus of Panama 4 to 5 million years ago, where we had northward dispersal of South American immigrants of the edentates, including the sloths and the armadillos and the glyptodonts. I don't think personally that there's a single explanation that can accommodate the extinction of all these megamanimals, and to me it's a more complex, overlapping explanation using multiple sources of information to explain why we don't see any of the Pleistocene megafauna today in Florida, and they're all extinct. So, thank you.
Okay. Do we have any questions in the audience? Okay, a few over here. So,
okay. Regarding the extinction of the megafauna about 10,000 years ago, it happened in the Americas, it happened in Europe. What's the explanation for Africa maintaining a large portion of its megafauna? I mean, it still had zebras and wildebeests and elephants and rhinoceros and
so, and also what was happening in Australia at the time as well. So it's complicated. As I said, I don't think there's a single cause, and for me to just say, oh, it was because the human populations may have been different back then, I don't. You're asking a very complicated question, and I can't really adequately answer that in a way that makes sense in a short period of time, other than I think it's probably a complex reason. Why was it happening in other places and not places like Africa, and less so in Australia? I'm not really sure. Other questions?
Can you talk just a little bit about, so not the Smilodon, but the margay, the jaguarundi, that kind of thing, the smaller cats? What was their story like, several thousand years ago in Florida?
Margay, I was just talking to Andy, and I don't want to steal his thunder because he's going to talk about margays. Did you set him up with that question? I'm going to defer. Sweet. I'm going to defer to Andy on that because let me just say that there were other small mammals that became extinct as well, that the jaguarundi and some of the other smaller mammals that are not considered to be mega mammals by the definition of them not exceeding the threshold of being 100 pounds or more, This is just part of the story of the overall extinctions and the reduction in biodiversity of mammals during the late Pleistocene.
This is Michael, right? Of the animals that did go extinct, was it pretty much across the board evenly, or was there? I mean, obviously we have smaller mammals now. We don't have these megafauna, but percentage-wise, do you think maybe some of the smaller ones were just, luckier in some aspect, or a greater percentage of the larger ones?
There was a
went?
greater percentage of the mega mammals that became extinct during the Pleistocene. Andy will tell us, Jim, what he has in his hand. Okay?
If Tom hadn't run away, I wouldn't be walking around with my prop before my talk.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so very much for this. It's a pleasure.